We are welcoming back to the show our three-time returning champion. He's a writer whose work can be found at Raw Story, Alternate, Salon, Common Dreams, all over the place, even a couple pieces on our site, dudissidents.com. Our great friend Anis Shivani. Anis, thanks so much for joining us again.
Well, thank you. Hello, everyone.
Absolutely, yeah. So this is our special year-end show. We thought, what a nice year-end theme to talk about 2020 as the beginning of the end of the American Empire. That is our sort of thesis statement on the year. And I just want, because this is right in both you guys' wheelhouse. Both of you guys have written and talked about this at length. And so I suspect you guys will be doing most of the talking for most of the show, which is fine with me. But I just want to set up what we're going to be talking about here. First of all, I speak for myself now. When I say that, when I say the country is finished, it's over, it's done, which I posted on our page last night, I don't necessarily mean that we're all going to die and that there's no hope and that nobody should still hope or fight for a better world.
I mean, not if you got a bunker.
Well, yeah, especially if you got a bunker.
You're not going to die.
But what I think about when I think of that is like the post-war British Empire. Like after World War II, Britain was exhausted. They were depleted. They were weakened. They kind of lost the interest and the capacity to maintain and expand their empire. And those decades following World War II were a great time for Labour Party politics in Britain. It's not a coincidence that after World War II, 3 years after that war ended, what was founded? The NHS. They gave their people health care. As they wound down the empire, they started taking better care of their people. So this is not to be overly doom and gloom. But I do have to say, because Anis, you talked about how you were more interested in talking about the cultural collapse of the country than the political. And I just want to start by sort of trying to link the two. We're recording this on Wednesday in the mid-afternoon in the midst of negotiations that are seemingly deadlocked over how many crumbs to toss the ordinary Americans in the midst of this once-in-a-century public health crisis. At the same time that this stalemate is going on. And look, by the time people hear this podcast, because these negotiations are fast moving, they may have agreed on something, right? That's not even the point. That's neither here nor there with regards to what I'm talking about. The point is, we have been locked over disagreements of how many dollars to put into a one-time payment to ordinary Americans to get them through this horrific crisis, which has already killed over 300,000 of us. At the same time this is going on, there is nearly unanimous, bipartisan, veto-proof support for a $750 billion spending bill for the Pentagon. The fact that those two things can exist at the same time without any mass uprising is, I think, a great indicator of how far this country has fallen culturally. So that's how I would connect the political decline to the cultural. So that's my opening statement, and now you guys can have at it.
Yeah, Russell, you want to go first?
I would like to share your optimism, and hey, look, it might be borne out, but it's hard to see where the changes that we need come from within the time window necessary to prevent true social collapse. The British Empire didn't have a social collapse. They had an unwinding of their empire. It wasn't an apocalypse scenario. That is really not what we're talking about here when we're talking about not only America, but climate change issues that were not at play then, that have a ticking clock running on them. That, I mean, let's face it, it's already probably too late. It's not a question of whether we're going to face devastating climate change consequences. It's a question of how far we're going to push the envelope on that. Things that we do now are mitigating the damage that is inevitable. We're not preventing it. The window for preventing it is already closed. But if you look at, and both you and I are attending this town hall tonight for forcing a vote on Medicaid, And not only are we having a hard time getting our progressive champions that we set up just as Democrats, I give them a monthly contribution, even with all the permutations of my feelings about whether or not the Democratic Party can be reformed. I mean, they're trying. God bless them. They've actually gotten some people in office. I support the work that they're doing. But we get these people in office and they don't even want to withhold their vote in a moment when, and this is the point that I think Jimmy Dore really hits it on the head. If not now, when? If this is not the time to do it, then when would be the time to do it? You're in the middle of a once in a century pandemic where 20 million, I believe the figure is, have lost their health insurance. And you've got the slimmest majority in the House in a century, such that you have this unusual leverage in the hands of a small minority of Congresspeople. If now is not the time to force a Medicare for all vote, when is? But what we've been talking about on the side is, why are they stopping there? Why aren't they saying, no, Nancy Pelosi is not going to be the Speaker of the House? If you try to put somebody in who's to the right of Barbara Lee, they're not going to be the Speaker of the House. We will not vote for anyone. You want to nominate Barbara Lee? She's a compromise. She takes corporate money and she's anti-war. Okay. No one's satisfied, but everybody's happy. Go with Barbara Lee. If you go any to the right of Barbara Lee, no, we're not voting for them. Why the fuck are we even talking about a Medicare for all vote? Why not force Nancy Pelosi out of her position and install a speaker who would bring Medicare for all to the floor anyway, because they support Medicare for all? You could kill two birds with one stone. Just refuse to have a speaker who would not bring that to the floor and get rid of Nancy Pelosi. Because look, this reminds me of the line in Apocalypse Now. There were a bunch of five-star generals who were going to give the whole circus away. That's what the Democratic Party is. You need to drastically rebrand this party. The best way to do that you have at your disposal right now, if you actually hope to win any elections in 2022, much less 2024, whack Nancy Pelosi. You want to do something that will make people say, hey, maybe different people are in charge of the Democratic Party now. Look what they did. They whacked Nancy Pelosi. Those assholes that we hate, wow, they're sending them to the guillotine. Maybe I should take another look at the Democratic Party. That's the best way to do it. If you just let these clowns keep going, they're going to give the whole circus away. You're going to wake up in 2024 with President Josh Hawley and all branches of government in Republican control.
All right. Thank you. You know, you're the only miserable prick on this planet who would take my opening statement as one of optimism. All I said was we shouldn't give up. I wasn't being optimistic. So I just want to correct that. I apologize if I was not clear on that. Anyway, let's let our guest have at it. Anis.
I have 3 words for you people. Cases of ramen.
Okay, good.
Hoard them.
Right. So, Keaton, I'd be interested in knowing when you came to this sort of thinking, the end of America, the end of American empire. I'm not sure what was your trigger point or if there were a series of steps, but it seems like maybe in the last year or so that we've been talking about this sort of stuff, you're come around more to this idea than I'm not sure if that's the case. But as for me, I've pretty much spent my whole adult life thinking about this idea. It really hit me at the end of the 90s as I was becoming a full-time writer and trying to understand where we were. The Newt Gingrich revolution had already taken place, Clinton, Lewinsky, which I saw as sort of a soft fascism coming on the scene. So I've been thinking about it for a long time, pretty much my whole adult life, my whole intellectual career. I've been giving this theme thought, what's actually happening. And I think it makes sense at this point to move away from the pandemic, Trump, Biden, election, all the stuff that we're talking about, and just take a step back and locate where we are. And I have a set of propositions, and then we can, if we want to, we can work back through the logic of what these conclusions signify and why I say those things. One thing would be that when you ask, if you ask, is America ending? I would reframe that and say, I would just say that America has already ended. The American project, American empire, the American experiment, it's already over. We're just now more and more people are beginning to come to terms with this. So around 99, 2000, I thought that it would be a half a century long process, 10 years of which, after the end of the Cold War from 1990 to 2000, had already gone by. Significant changes had taken place to move us closer to the end, even by 2000. Then I felt that from 2000 to 2020 would be another transition period. And then the final unraveling, in my opinion, occurs from now to around 2050. So we got another 30 years. We're at the midway point of this unraveling of empire. And I think for people who are trying to understand the situation, instead of thinking this is America, a democracy, how do we reform it? How do we save it? The better question would be, how do we disengage from this sinking ship? I personally am at a point, and have been for a long time, where I feel that if anybody thinks, activist, thinker, intellectual, whatever, that America as a project is something worth saving at this point, if you believe in any kind of reform, activism, intellectual input, whereby you want to reform or save America, I consider you, and I'm sorry if this sounds harsh, criminally evil and complicit in that project. And that goes back to, it's interesting that you mentioned World War II and Britain. And Russell is right, because America was ready. It was a handover from Britain to America. So it's a different sort of situation. There's nobody to hand this over to, because what we did in the last 80 years, and that's the really evil part of American empire, is that the last 80 years of the American project was to systematically eliminate ideological competitors. So I interpret World War II as essentially a battle between the Eastern collective idea. It was Japan at first, and then Russia, which we took care of, Europe, primarily Germany, European romanticism, an alternative to American capitalism. We eliminated that. That's how I basically interpret World War II, aside from the mythology that has become the foundational myth for what we've done in the last 80 years, which is to get rid of competitors by constructing pseudo-capitalist dictatorships all over the world, in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia. We got rid of pan-Arab or pan-Islamic socialism, which was their project in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, by constructing fundamentalist or military dictatorships. So that's the kind of evil that we were talking about. So my proposition would be, we should celebrate the end of America. We should celebrate and be happy about the end of American empire, because I don't know of anything more evil in human history among all the empires that have gone by, and to the extent that I've studied them, and obviously because of technological reach and just the capacity to enclose and encompass everything, all forms of alternative human consciousness, and this war on the planet, on natural life, on animal species, on the planet itself. No empire had the capacity to wreak this kind of damage and havoc. So this has been the most destructive empire, I think, in history. It is now coming to an end. And the question to ask is, what should be the fate of an empire so evil? Now, I know the meritocrats will say, well, America has done good things too. And they may talk about the spread of democracy, or I don't know what else they're going to talk about. Television, communications, internet, there's Facebook all over the world, whatever. I'm sure they got their theories about how America is not as bad as I'm making it out to be. But I just presented to you the horrible scenario where we destroyed the European alternative, European romanticism, Japan, Russia, any form of socialism, any form of collective action. And the American empire and America is ending now because we have succeeded beyond our wildest expectations. It's ending because we have accomplished exactly what Madison and so on set out to do, which was this form of insane individualism, which makes a war on the planet, which doesn't take into consideration other people. It's pure selfishness, and that's why it's coming to an end, because we've succeeded. This is the end point. And the last 30 years after we got away from the Cold War and there wasn't this Russian competitor, that's been the really telling period from 1990 to 2000, when we've been unleashed on the world, upon ourselves, upon people here. And it's a form of insanity. And we can talk about different signs. And since you mentioned, that I talked about culture in the beginning. At this moment in 2020, we can see different signs of why empire is ending, America is ending. And those are very different kinds of signs than what people were worried about in the 1970s. And I remember I was a child in the 70s and then growing up in the 80s, and people were very worried about America coming to an end at that point too. But that was a very different kind of situation in the 1970s. This, what's happening now, there are different kinds of signs altogether. So I'm saying it has ended, and we should celebrate it. We should do everything possible to hasten it. Not that there's going to be necessarily anything better after this, but just because that's what this empire, evil empire, well, Reagan called it the evil empire, right? So I think he was projecting, and we should have a party once it's over.
Well, Times Square is open. They're not having a ball drop this year. Right. So maybe this is kismet,
I think our friend Anis is discounting the Big Mac, Coca-Cola, the filmography of Fred Astaire. We have made some contributions, my friend.
You forgot John Coltrane and jazz and Louis Armstrong.
I will hold "Singing in the Rain"
and
up to the best of Roman.
Yeah. No, you could talk about certain periods, and I thought about that. There have been certain moments, and it's more in the 20th century than in the 19th century.
Have you ever had a Big Mac? I mean, they're tasty.
No, since I was a kid. No, not since I was a kid. But if I had saved it from when I was a kid, it would still be around.
It would actually, and that in and of itself is quite an accomplishment.
That is an accomplishment. It would still be on my desk, all these decades later, and ready to be eaten. That's what I'm talking about. No, there have been these periods of cultural renaissance, the 1920s with modernism, art, music, jazz, blues. You talk about the 1950s and 60s. I'm more interested even in the 50s and the 60s. And obviously we did contribute to, but it's interesting that both those periods, I think, followed 2 world wars. Mm-hmm. And many American servicemen went and fought. And so you have Hemingway and, in the 1920s, you see this effervescence of cultural, and that was a real cultural contribution to the world. Faulkner, right? In the 50s, with the beats and jazz really coming on its own, all kinds of cultural expression, art, music, those came from sort of this interaction with the world.
Well, that's exactly my point. Yeah. Well, that's exactly what I was saying. Like there, at certain points, there were responses, right? People actually responded to what was going on around them. Now we don't have that. Now we have Disney Plus and HBO Max, right? And all these Marvel superhero sequels, right? There's just like the regurgitation of the same crap. There is no cultural response to the political collapse. That was my original point. Yeah.
Right. Can I just respond to that?
Sure.
So that's the key point, is there is no response. There cannot be a response. And I've thought a lot about this. And as a writer who has not been part of this institutional mechanism, the MFA system, the creative writing, and, not been part of the academy since I've been a writer. So that's the crux of the matter, is that if you look at writing today and art, I would say music, painting, there is no imagination. Art has been integrated in the meritocratic academy, which is simply a form of reproduction of the sorts of thought process that justify empire. So what I was beginning to observe in the 90s, early 90s, mid 90s, people who wanted to be writers or artists would gravitate toward these MFA programs. They would teach in the academy as opposed to being on their own. And since Russell mentioned, these cultural contributions, I mean, if you look at the biographies of these great jazz musicians or these artists, how was it? I mean, they were like 14 years old from broken families, and they go to, New York for a musical apprenticeship or Kansas City or Los Angeles or whatever. And by the time they're 18, 19, 20, they're creating real music or art or writing. That's not how it happens now. You cannot even imagine being recognized or validated if you even think of doing that. First of all, you wouldn't be able to financially survive. You would be dead. But even if you were able to get through somehow, you would not be accepted. So art and culture is entirely integrated in the academy. And
I mean, I was joking about the Big Mac, but now that you took me seriously, in all seriousness, I'm working on an article right now about how the arts have changed in my time, because I was one of those kids you're talking about. I lied about my age to get my first directing gig. I snuck out to Manhattan from Queens when I was 19. I told people I was 27 and, got a directing job. And for me, being this kid from the outer boroughs, from very blue collar kind of working class neighborhood, I was just absolutely just blown away by this bohemian Manhattan world that I had managed to infiltrate.
Right.
And the scene then was so different from what it is now, because this was a time when the first theater artists I was exposed to, these were people who were paying $250 a month to live in apartments in pre-hipster Williamsburg.
Right.
One of the reasons they lived in Williamsburg was because they could walk across the bridge because they didn't have money for train fare.
Right.
That was how they got to the theater. Right. You had a diversity of race, which it's very revisionist. You have kind of the woke artists now behaving as if this is an innovation. It's been quite some time that you could wander into a bohemian art scene in an American city and have it be supportive of racism and homophobia. So not only did you have a diversity of race, more so actually than I think you have now, you had a diversity of class. Like there were people there who lived comfortably on the Upper West Side, but there were also people literally living above the theater because they couldn't afford to go anyplace else.
Right.
And the woman who owned it, she's still alive, remarkably. She's in her hundreds.
No, she recently died. You talk about Edith.
Oh, she finally passed away?
Yeah.
I didn't even see that.
Yeah.
Right.
She lived to be like 105.
Yeah, she was she was ancient.
So, and she was still technically the artistic director into her hundreds. But now, this is the irony. There was, over the time that I was involved in the arts in New York, it became much less economically diverse. There became much less of a class diversity, because as you say, as cities started to become more expensive, as basically the grandchildren of the white flight generation began to return from the suburbs to the cities, they brought their sensibilities with them. And they also brought their economic strata with them, driving up the rents throughout. And they remade a place that people used to come to because they wanted to be the Ramones or they wanted to be Andy Warhol into a place that was inspired by Sex and the City and the consumer porn that made them want to move to New York because they had consumed that image of that's what New York is. And they remade it into that. So at that point, none of what you're describing, the 17-year-old who's going to come with an army duffel bag to the city to be a painter, they can't even afford to be in the city, much less to get to the gallery, to make it to the theater. They can't even come to the place to have that opportunity. And the reason I started writing this article is because I'm sure, just like yourself, I debate a lot of people, and I find the absolutely most horrible people to debate are woke artists. They are the fucking worst.
Yeah.
And really, critical race theory, the woke concept is really a white suburban middle class sensibility. It's a politics. You have to have not lived a day in your life in the real world to think makes any kind of sense. And that's why it's been so embraced by the arts community. Exactly. Because now it's an arts community. This is the irony. If you really still had that class diversity, a lot of these people that they claim to care so much about, if they were actually present in these institutions, it wouldn't have caught on like that in arts communities. It's because it's dominated by these white suburbanites who don't have the depth of thought to question any of this. That it's become such a thing in the arts world.
Right. Well, Russell has raised some really important points. And let's try to reframe this and connect this to the end of empire. So one of the things I was going to mention is, we talk about cities becoming expensive and these exclusive enclaves, and the words we use to describe it is gentrification, right? That's the word we use to describe it. So let's change the vocabulary. And if we have a narrative that this is empire coming to an end, and if we start picking out signs, let's not say gentrification, let's call them fortress cities. So one of the things that happens at the end of empires is the elites massively congregate in these fortresses. They exclude the poor people, and that's basically the definition of literary dystopia as well, right? And so they are congregating, and that process has accelerated so dramatically in my lifetime in the last few years, right? So it's just a few cities now: LA, New York, Seattle, Portland, Austin, Boston, etc.
And now with the pandemic, they're fleeing back.
They're going back where? You mean going out of the...
They're fleeing back to the exurbs now because they don't want to be around the sick people.
Right. Vacate the cities for a while because now there's plague in the cities, but they'll come back. The cities belong to them. They're just too expensive. We can't ever really go back to those cities. They're theirs. They're not selling the properties, even if they may be, leaving for a while. So it's like
you're right.
Refuge from the plague. But these fortress cities and fortress mentality, and this also connects to this fortress ideology. And the thing that disturbed me the most about this end stage of empire is it's not real culture, it's pseudo culture. You said Sex and the City, right? So they're producing pseudo culture. It's not real culture. It is anti-art, it's anti-human, anti-civilization, anti-consciousness. And in that sense, we are all complicit. We are all responsible. Because if you are an American child, 5 years old or whatever, going to school, you're being trained in this, you're being imparted pseudo-cultural capital. And that cultural capital, whether it's in terms of music or language or vocabulary or accessing works of literature or whatever, that's what's used to sustain that's how empires justify themselves. That's how empire justifies, because of our sense of superiority. We have democracy to export. Look at those stupid Syrians or Libyans or whatever. It's all justified by means of this pseudo cultural capital. And when you grow older, that 5-year-old, when they become 20 or 25 or whatever, then they engage in this woke social justice vocabulary. There's nothing on earth more removed today from actual social justice than the American vocabulary of social justice. This bullshit, woke, politically correct, identity politics, and then at a higher level still, if you are an academic, you get into theory and how we took French theory, which had many valid critiques of capitalism, Saussure and Derrida and Foucault, especially in terms of the nature of discourse. They had very important things today to say, but we imported it, converted it into a neat package that becomes actually anti-human, anti-art. This cohort of people that you're talking about, right, the woke people, They have no imagination. They have no apparatus to distinguish between real art and fake art.
Well, I actually think that's part of why it's become popular in those communities as well, because if you've been around arts communities, and I'm sure you have, I mean, you're a writer, of course you have. Most people aren't very talented.
No.
And for the last 100 years, really, I mean, ever since Duchamp signed a toilet, artists haven't had the certainty of formalism. So giving people rules that actually tell you, yes, if you do work that virtue signals certain cultural values, it's good work. Well, of course, people in a desperately insecure business, most of whom aren't talented in the first place, who are in this terrifying position where for 100 years at least, you haven't really known, there haven't been any rules for what good work or bad work is. This is like throwing crackers to a starving person, right? Hey, if you just signal all of these virtues, then you've done good work, right? You're going to be praised for it.
And that's what you're told from the very beginning. You're special. You're some pathetic 5-year-old, 10-year-old, and you're a great artist. You're a genius. You're special. You're gifted. Whatever. And then you go, and by the age of 30, you got MFAs and institutional credibility, and you are producing bad art. And not only that, but acting woke and dismissing the good art of the past and the present because you have no criteria of judging and distinguishing. You're yourself producing horrible bad art. You're producing fake art. How are you going to distinguish, and recognize good art when it does come along? And that intersects with politics. So, I mean, culture, politics, science and technology, and the economy, they have become completely intertwined in this end stage of empire. They're not, and so these same individuals are, you might think it's odd that somebody who knows Derrida and is sophisticated, knows the Frankfurt School and so on and so forth, understands modernism, would then be going to a therapist, right? But the therapy, and it's really simplistic, but it's basically the same idea. And I think particularly among young people, they have totally assimilated this idea of survivalism. They've figured out that they have to survive at all costs. It is really Darwinian. It's very Darwinian, and they've figured out that they've got to do what they've got to do to survive and to get ahead. Part of that is the virtue signaling, right? The wokeness, because if they don't do that, they'll be eliminated in a second. So this is a way that they convey to their superiors in the elite meritocracy, I'm one of you, and they have to do that at every stage. I mean, you start from the beginning to the end. At no point can you deviate and send the wrong signal, because if you do, then you're just eliminated, right?
Well, I think.
But again, I just have to ask the question, why then? Because you just to connect this to like the here and now political moment. Someone like Nancy Pelosi represents the exact type of person that you're talking about. Just empty woke signaling, absolutely nothing else. We talk about forced to vote. We talk about, should we force her out? Why can't the point be made that, look, you already have centrist Democrats who every 2 years or every year in the session say they're going to vote against her, right? Opposing her from the right because she represents, San Francisco values, right? The woke values. Right. And then you have people from the left saying, well, we want her gone because materially she's not down with our program, right? So it's this should be the easiest thing in the world to bounce her ass, but it's not. And this is why I think that the country's in so much trouble, because we can't even harness the obvious popular support that would go to doing something like replacing the Speaker of the House, who represents this very narrow slice of meritocratic wokeism, right? But we can't do it.
Because they're talking about white fragility. They're talking about white fragility and white privilege and white racism. That's all they want to talk about, this whole meritocratic elite. And one of the signs I mentioned is, if you look back at policies that benefit people, American people, For the last 50 plus years, there have been no substantive policies. It's not just Nancy Pelosi now, 50 years have gone by without any, since LBJ, substantive policy. So Clinton, you had the earned income tax credit, which was his great accomplishment. He ended welfare and, NAFTA, horrible, horrible things happened. But in return, there was this EITC, the earned income tax credit, which is basically a neoliberal idea because it goes into earning. You have to work and earn in order to get some benefit.
While you're also much more likely to get audited if you claim it.
Exactly, right. And the wealthy people, the wealthiest are not.
It makes a lot of people who qualify for it not ask for it.
Right, exactly. And it's not a universal benefit that everybody gets. You have to earn it somehow. And that's the main point. Bush, you have, No Child Left Behind, a horrible policy which plugs into this anti-humanization, sort of this end of liberal education, right? Obama, you get the quintessential neoliberal policy, the Affordable Care Act, hatched at the Heritage Foundation, legislated by Mitt Romney in Massachusetts. That's horrible, right? So in 50 years, give me an example where you've had any policy, public policy that's benefited the people in a substantive way. There may have been little things here and there. You can think about Bush the father with disability, environment, clean air, because that was a sort of a transition period at the end of the Cold War when you were talking about the peace dividend. But other than that, it's a vacuum of policy for 50 years. And what's interesting is that, and this is, again, connecting this to the end of empire, the game that we've been playing for 30 years now is to keep the fight going and to keep the game going, keep playing the game. In the 50s, John Kenneth Galbraith and other economists were talking about affluence. Affluence was the illness. We were too rich, too affluent. That was based on a certain unnatural dominance of America from the end of the World War till about 1973 when that ended. So that was one period. And then you come to the 90s. And since then, the idea is to keep playing the game, to keep fighting. So to bring it to the current moment, when Bernie Sanders lost in March, if you remember that all the intellectuals were very upset when it looked like he would win in January and February, right? They were like, we'd rather vote for Trump than Bernie. Okay, the same people, the minute Bernie lost, they all came out with op-eds and their podcasts and everything saying, basically validating Bernie's agenda, universal health care, those 2 or 3 things, right? The student debt forgiveness, etc. And they were like, this agenda is valid. We need to work toward that. But they said, we can't have it now. So they weren't saying, let's do it now. They were saying, this is aspirational. This is for 50 years or 100 years or whatever. This is aspirational. Same with climate change. We can't do it now. So if you look at Elizabeth Warren's vocabulary, ultimate meritocrat, right? They just fucking love her. Fight. She uses the word fight, fight, fight all the time. So did Hillary. So did Al Gore. And so did, sad to say, Bernie in March and April. He started using their vocabulary of fighting for it. So he moves it from something achievable now, something that should have been done 30, 50, or 100 years ago, to some point in the future. And that's what AOC is about too. It's something that we can work for in the future. So the reason why they don't protest Nancy Pelosi is because they're invested in these woke ideas, white fragility. I just read this guy, Ibram Kendi, I hope I'm saying his name right, and it was a horrible book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. So there's
no. Right?
Horrible stuff. So two people right now. There's Robin DiAngelo, her book, White Fragility. I just threw it out. I should have read it. And then there's this other guy, this black guy, Ibram Kendi, How to Be an Anti-Racist. And Keaton, his main idea in the book is, if you haven't read it, is the fact that he ever thought that Black people might have any responsibility in terms of being poor or their condition, right? That he is on a mission to purge the idea of the victims being responsible in any way for their condition. And he considers that racism, so the whole book is about how do I purge myself of my own racism. So if you're so preoccupied in that, and if you think that Nancy Pelosi being a woman, I mean, that alone, I mean, she's a woman speaker, right? game over. So that gives her a 10-year, honeymoon period. That's what we were cheering, 10, 12 years ago when she first became Speaker, Madam Speaker. How can you don't have the intellectual framework to address policy issues? I mean, Medicare for all, 2000 stimulus, these trillions of dollars in giveaways that even Bernie supported, that first horrible 3.5 trillion or whatever that thing was, right? That monstrosity. There's no vocabulary. There's no imagination. What do these people do? The first time Trump won, they were like, who are these people? These fucking deplorables. That's half the country. That's all the poor people. That's everybody who's not a meritocrat. That's, by the way, also Latinos and Black people who are not meritocrats. These are the people of color you say you support by means of your social justice vocabulary. And what do they do this time when Trump did so well, better than they thought he would, and 50% of people voted for him? They were like, oh my God. They did the same thing in November of 2020. They were like, oh my God, who are these people? I don't want to live in this country anymore. Well, the fact is they don't live in this country anymore. They really don't, and they haven't for a long time. And that's a sign of empire collapsing too, because these people are so disengaged from the reality around them, right? They live in this bubble with social justice vocabulary, theory, therapy, physically protected. They act superior. And these are the last believers in empire because they still believe in America. They still believe
because it's working for them.
Well, because it's a fortress, right? I mean, you mentioned there were fortress cities. There's fortress politics now, too. The thing that struck me, I forget if this was at a debate or a town hall or wherever it was, but it was deep into the COVID crisis. It may have been a town hall or the VP debate. I forget the exact context. But they were talking about, the question was to either Biden or Kamala, depending on what the setting was. We're talking about, you want to raise the minimum wage to $15, which is 2/3 of what the minimum wage would be if it kept up with the rate of inflation. All right. So not an overly aspirational goal, to say the least.
Right.
They said, but we've also been talking about the strain that COVID has put on business owners. And so is now the time to raise the minimum wage? So if you look at the framing of that question, they framed a question about wages, about labor, about the value of labor from the perspective of can the owners of capital afford to dole this out? That tells you who's watching the town hall or who's watching the debate in the first place. The people who are making these decisions are the capital class who have cordoned themselves off. That's the primary process, right? I mean, in 2016, you had Bernie mopping the floor with HRC about on everything. It was Bernie versus her. It was all general public opinion polls favored him. But within this bubble called the Democratic Party, he did not have that same support, and that's why he lost, right? And so it's the same dynamic in place. It's like, yes, we have popular will behind things like universal health care and higher wages, but there's no mechanism by which we can harness that and turn it into real results because the process itself is a fortress that only certain people have access to.
Right. It's completely broken. Politics is completely broken. And that's why I said, you can't name me a substantive policy despite all the social upheavals that have come along in 50 plus years. You can't name me a single policy. I mean, Nixon was proposing UBI, then Carter, maybe at that time there was discussion of universal health care, but none of that happened because it is totally broken. And
Nixon's universal health care proposal was better than Obamacare's.
Of course, there's no question because the times were different. It wasn't so much Nixon, but we were in a period where the power elite had not yet, exercised total hegemony. So these ideas were percolating to the very top. And Nixon would, not just that, but many ideas that would be Bernie Sanders type radical, or even more than that today. You'd be like, what is this? But that's, again, not Nixon. It's just that those were the times. And Keaton, you were talking in the beginning about you mentioned the pandemic. You were talking about Medicare for all, the stimulus, and Russell, you mentioned social collapse early on, right? I look at it as
twice before breakfast, usually.
What was that?
I mention it twice before breakfast, usually.
Right, social collapse, right? Yes. Okay. Have we not been in a period of social collapse for at least 30 years, which I call sort of collective insanity, right? I mean, it's just,
absolutely. Have you ever read From Dawn to Decadence, 500 Years of Western Civilization by Jacques Berzon?
No, but I know
French historian.
Know about him. Yes, I know his work. Yeah.
He basically that book was kind of his final statement, and right at the beginning in the introduction, you kind of feel like you stumbled into an Anne Rice novel, because this is a book published, I believe, in the 90s, and he begins with, I first began to contemplate the decline of Western civilization in 1924 as a young man. You're just like, how are you even lucid enough to write this like enormous book that you could beat someone to death with on this subject and be so cogent and coherent? But really what he illustrates is that whereas a lot of books that focus on civilizational collapse talk a lot about infrastructure and overrunning resources and so on and so forth, Berzon in that book really focuses on the cultural symptoms of civilizational collapse, and some of the things that he identifies going all the way back to Persia is a cynical relationship to institutions begins to take hold. Interestingly, he noted that the use of profanity as a very common means of expressing yourself starts to become much more mainstream. But really interestingly, in regards to what you were talking about earlier with the arts, he points out that when a culture has exhausted itself, essentially, and he's really coming from a theory of psychological exhaustion, because are the problems at the later stage really so much greater than the problems of building an empire were?
No.
So why can't you solve it later?
The solutions are really
a certain psychological and spiritual just sapping of will and vigor, just like in the lifespan of a human, later stages of the empire. But something he points out is that what you see in the last stages are a repetition of old cultural forms, that the poetry now is a reference to early poetry. The architecture is a reference to early architecture, that truly new paradigms, truly new ideas aren't really able to establish themselves.
Right.
And it's a reference to a reference to a reference.
Right. In that sense, you could make sense of Trump in that way. And I have, thought about that before. He reiterated this founding mythology, open racism, white supremacy, this disdain toward other races, which had been covered up, right? But he brings
bad dye jobs.
Right, exactly. There you go, right. Bad dye jobs, maybe that was much later, right, yeah. But, he just brings it out, the open white supremacy of, let's say, 200 to 250 years ago. He brings it out in the open, and that is our foundation. That's who we are. And people, the meritocrats are upset because he blows the cover on this false innocence. This is another thing, by the way. I mean, I've thought you make a very good point. And as I was thinking about this today, I thought this idea kept coming to me again and again, is this moral panic and guilt. The intellectuals in this country and the people with power or with any kind of access to, language and vocabulary, I mean, we're suffering from this tremendous moral guilt and panic. And that is part of the exhaustion. Is we have been able to get away because of fortuitous circumstances, World War I, to what happened in Europe, etc. There was never an accounting for genocide, for slavery. There has never been an accounting for what we did in World War II. People know about Dresden, the firebombing, right, mainly through Vonnegut and other sources. But we flattened and destroyed as many of Germany's historic cities and towns as we could, and we didn't need to. And the same with Japan. So there has been no accounting of that, of atomic, destruction of Japan, of everything that we've been doing for the last 80 years as an empire, destroying democratic movements all over the world, instituting dictatorships just to promote this vicious form of American capitalism that is really at war with the planet at this point. And what's really disturbing to me is that the way I see the American project, and why I said at the beginning we should celebrate the end of it, is because you could make a case for capitalism. You could, in some benign form of, it's still it's difficult, but you can see that there's a way that you could speak on behalf of it, say some positive things, right? But the way America has absorbed capitalism, redefined it in this particular way, and more importantly, absorbed liberalism, which was not exclusively an American thing. That was French, and it was British, and it was European. So it's not our exclusive monopoly, but we have now distorted and assimilated liberalism and capitalism completely, to an extent where when American empire ends, I think in the next decade or so, the signs will be clearer. It seems like liberalism and capitalism will both go with it. It's become completely entwined. I don't see a way where American empire comes to an end, America as this entity that we know now comes to an end, and liberalism and capitalism as we know them now survive somehow. I think they've become completely inseparable, mainly because we Americans eliminated the alternatives. We even eliminated not the alternatives like socialism or collective forms of action, but even variants within capitalism, right? Mixed economies in Eastern Europe. We eliminated those. We eliminated China as an alternative model, India. So even the variants or European, social democracy, we haven't eliminated that, but we've been trying damned hard. And I think that's mainly what the war on terror was about over the last 20 years, especially in the 2000s, was to eliminate Europe as a competitive model. So it's become really difficult at this point to separate these things and unpack them. They've just become this one big thing, which is, pervasive planet-wide.
Well, let me ask you something, because you mentioned how, Trump sort of blew the cover off of, a lot of the sins that the country committed and hasn't been able to reconcile. Right. But, Russell mentions a sort of sapping of the psyche, a sapping of the culture, a sapping of the will. Yeah. And Trump, and this is perhaps a more superficial point than yours, but I think this is really the key to his becoming president and to, Trumpism sort of enduring even past a Trump loss, right? Right. He blew the cover off of the despair and hopelessness that people were feeling at the time. Right. He gave validation to that. He gave recognition to that. Most politicians don't do that. They're not allowed to do that, right? People running for office have to be optimistic, right? Sure. They have to talk about America in these glowing terms. He came up and he said, right, our best days are ahead of us. He came out and said the American dream is dead. And that resonated with people because it wasn't that they even had,
well, he did promise to bring it back. I mean, he still ran on the optimistic message.
I don't think they ever bought that. And I think that the fact that 74 million of them voted for him again is evidence that they never really bought into that part. It wasn't that they thought he was going to bring it back. It's that he validated their sense that it was gone. And in that way, in that very twisted way of his, he empathized with them because he communicated to them that he understood where they were. Now, the liberal meritocrat doesn't know what it means to feel hopeless and detached and despaired because their lives are great. They're doing great. Right. So to them, it's deplorable to think that way. Well, what do you mean you don't care about your life? How dare you not care about your life? But Trump gave validation to people who had already lost hope in the system. And I think that's why he won. And I think his staggering vote total in 2020 proves that theory, that even though he didn't make anything better, they still doubled down and voted for him again in even greater numbers under more horrific circumstances.
Of a horribly
under more horrific circumstances. Yeah.
Right.
So I'm sorry, Anis, I had a question. What do you what do you feel about that?
I was like, it's like an improv. I was like, do I pick up the ball here?
No, because you're right, exactly. Like a zip, zap, zop game in the theater. But you've spoken to this before. You seem to recognize this. You seem to understand this. And so I was just curious if you had any thoughts about that.
About what exactly? That Trump
the power of despair, the power of hopelessness, the power of this sort of malaise that the country is feeling, how that translates into politics.
It's a very positive thing. It's a very positive thing. I don't see it negative at all. To be in this sense of despair about the country, it's some form of recognition. It's not that Trumpists are thinking, oh my God, we committed genocide, slavery, we destroyed for 80 years. We have killed millions and millions of people. We have destroyed entire countries. And they're feeling bad about that. It's not that. But they do recognize that the American experiment is over. There's not mobility, the inequality. They may not be able to say it in those terms, but there are codes that Trump uses. You know, when he says Jeff Bezos fucking evil, and this is a sign of the end of empires, right? This is probably the greatest sign, is this form of inequality is unsustainable. This always goes with the end of, empires, when you have like 8 people owning half the wealth in the country. And these figures are figures of hate that you should hate. So even in this latest military bill, right? Or actually Mitch McConnell proposed today that, we can do the 2000 if we strip away the social media, protection of speech, whatever.
Right, they're haggling over what strings are going to be attached to the relief.
That is something symbolically so important that at this point, even after the election, it matters a lot to people. It matters a lot, and these really are evil figures. Jeff Bezos, Zuckerberg, people hate them for good reason, and they signify and, assimilating themselves, embodying themselves, every single thing that we're talking about. They're just the extreme form. And Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos is just the extreme form of this person who's taking the whole thing down and taking tens of millions of Americans down with him. I mean, he's going up theoretically, financially, right? But what is going to be left if there's no country? So I think, the moral. So Trump comes along and says we are not innocent, and he was very explicit about that. And he said, "What do you think? We don't kill people. We don't kill foreign leaders. We don't steal elections." He literally actually said that. So to blow the cover off of innocence,
I thought that was one of the better moments of his.
That really was. That was very early on. He said, "You don't think we do that?"
And that was before the Super Bowl too. That was before like the most jingoistic bread and circuses events you can possibly think of.
Yeah. I love him. I'll say it on record. I love him for all those reasons, that he is a counterpoint to this fake fucking innocence, which is the ultimate justification. So one thing that runs through woke politics, woke social justice action, woke art, woke writing, woke criticism, woke everything, woke existence in terms of, exorcising white fragility from your own body or whatever, is innocence, fake innocence. And nobody's innocent in this project. Mm-hmm. And least of all, the people who are woke. So I love him for the fact that he validates the despair. That's not, and again, as we said, there's not a rational, coherent thought process about the origins and end of empire in that form of despair that Trump validates, but it's something important. It's something important to understand. And it means more to me personally than the opposite, which is this fake innocence, or we can call it, the woke stuff.
Well, the other very powerful part of that is that when Trump sort of talked honestly about, how cynical the U.S. can be, right? About the real dark underbelly of this empire. That offended the woke people, but there's something very, very sort of revealing about that. He revealed that kind of shit, that whole like rah, 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 God bless America bullshit, doesn't even mean anything to the people who, up until he ran for president, were the ones most invested in like perpetuating that myth, right? Like the Republican base during the Bush years, they were the ones with the American flags on their cars and the support the troops on the bumpers and everything, right? And when he kind of unmasked, is that that mythology doesn't even mean that much to them. Which is why when the Democrats in 2016 had all the balloons at the convention and the red, white, and blue, and all the corporate media stooges were like, the Democrats have reclaimed patriotism, right? Because the Democrats are now the more Reagan-esque party. That didn't mean anything. Because it was never about this like
get all these Biden Republicans, right?
Well, right, exactly. Trump but to the very people who voted for Trump, that didn't mean anything.
Well, sure, because you have to remember who was Creedence Clearwater Revival's Fortunate Son. Who was that written for and about?
Right, exactly.
And that sensibility, it ain't me. I ain't no fortunate son. When you're the one they always want to send to war, right? They never forgot that. That sensibility never completely left that community. It was not hard for Trump to just goose them a little bit and bring that back to the surface of their sensibility, right? Because did the idea that basically poor people are going off and fighting rich men's wars ever really leave those communities? Did they ever really stop feeling that way at core? I don't think so. I mean, the Trump success tells you no, they never did. The vision we have of those people and those parts of the country lacks nuance. Because the same people that you encounter who just get more obnoxious by the year, where, if there is one thing that liberals all agree on, it's that everyone who's not them is a fucking deplorable. Like if you give them any opening to start signaling their loathing for people who don't have education, who don't have college degrees, who live out there, they will latch onto that as any kind of opportunity to go there. And the people who represent those parts of the country in the media are that on steroids. They're the upper crust.
And that's also a projection of their own failures, because after 2016, they knew they screwed up. They knew they dropped the ball. Yeah. I know liberals who confess afterwards, I should have never gone along with this Hillary Clinton thing. They knew they screwed up.
I think I know exactly one who was willing to actually say straight out that they made a bad call with Hillary.
Well, I know two or three, so there you go. But I have heard it. But for every one or two people who will admit that, there are 100 or 1,000 people who feel it and can't bring themselves to admit it. And so how do you rationalize that failure? You have to just say, well, it's not our fault. The people who voted for Trump are deplorables. They're racist. They're horrible, right? That shifts the blame from I made a bad call to, well, these people are just too evil and stupid and irredeemable to do what we think is the right thing. So it's a consciousness of guilt on their part. It's a projection of fault.
Well, it's also, I think, fear. I was reading something the other day that was basically arguing that civilization, one of the reasons civilization itself is really psychologically damaging to humans, particularly this hyper-capitalist version of it, is because we're actually naturally altruistic. That basically the whole Hobbesian vision of pre-civilized life is completely wrong. That as a rule, you study hunter-gatherers, they tend to be altruistic. They tend to share everything. And if you take down a bigger buffalo, it doesn't matter. It's going to get shared amongst the entire tribe. They tend to be leaderless. you really don't see social class until you get agriculture. Once you get that, you start to get war, you start to get strife, you start to get internecine violence, and so on. And one of the examples he uses, because they'll look at primates very often, people who try to portray our ancestry as dark and savage. And actually, if you take monkeys and you run experiments where you give one monkey a grape for a task and you give the other monkey a pineapple, which they don't like as much, not only will the monkey getting the pineapple get upset, the monkey getting the grape will get upset. Like there's an innate sense of fairness and equality that you can actually see at a primate level. So what's happening with these suburban white people who are screaming about white privilege while being the most privileged white people in this society? They're getting more grapes and they know it.
Right.
All of this is trying to tell the other monkeys, no, really, I'm not one of the grape hoarders. That's not me. I'm no, man. If you're having a pineapple,
and what are you doing? They're like, can I get some grapes? And they go, well, no, I'm working on my white fragility.
Yeah.
Come back to me in 500 years or 100 years. We'll talk about that then. For right now, this is my project. I'm trying to figure out, where I'm not woke, and I'm working on that. But they're not going to give them any grapes.
I'm trying to understand theoretically why I have too many grapes, but I'm not going to just do I'm not going to take the Occam's razor approach and just give you some of my fucking grapes.
Exactly. Exactly. I know that I have more grapes, and I'm against that. God damn it. And hey, hang on. Don't look at me. Look at this guy over here, because not only does this guy have more grapes, but he has really retrograde social views. Go get him. Get that guy.
Right. Yeah.
Right. Well, to relate this again to the end of empire, in a way, I think what the meritocrat class is trying to do with Trump is censor him. The level of intellectual conformity which comes out of these elite educational institutions, and now the art institutions, and everything that involves the production of culture, and now Silicon Valley is just so uniform that, and this is one thing you would agree, Keaton and Russell, that we've seen a lot of in 2020 is the rise of censorship. Was already going on, but now it's reached extreme levels where you can't, it doesn't matter who you are, you'll just be taken down. And
absolutely.
I'm sorry?
No, I said absolutely. Sorry. I didn't mean to cut you off.
So in that sense, they're trying to take down and censor and delete and cancel not just Trump, but his 70 million supporters. They don't want, and there's been a shift since the election, is how their discourse has been made to, I don't know if you've noticed this, but Trump was there all the time, setting the agenda, talking, his people, supporters, these crazy op-ed people, etc. They've all been canceled, and they'll be canceled even more. So that whole point of view that questions meritocracy and our role in the world is just going to go away. It's the easy thing is just to censor it out of existence. And that shows actually how weak they are, because censorship only comes into play when you know that you're in the wrong. Your ideas are so weak, they can't withstand scrutiny. So the only thing you can do is just cancel it.
And, you made me think of something.
Right. This is not the behavior of a confident or a confident culture. Especially a culture, look, the Russian Soviet Empire was kind of notorious for its lack of a sense of humor. Why? Because when your premises are weak, you can't afford laughter.
Right.
Because you can't afford real comedy. You can't afford for people to start poking fun at the regime, right?
No, you can't. No, yeah.
It's the same thing. If you've ever tried to debate one of these people, I have actually found, forget about trying to debate them on the merits. They won't do that. Basically, the entire exchange is a witch trial where we already know you're a witch, and now the conversation is about establishing the evidence. the only way you can deal with it is actually with humor, because humor, they don't know how to respond to because they're humorless.
Right.
Like if you make jokes, they can't. It's like a wall. Like
well, an example of what you're talking about, I think, is, I mean, I posted up a little joke that said, you know, these direct payment negotiations are actually kind of a perfect metaphor for the two-party duopoly, because the Democrats want 2,000, the Republicans want 600. And that's about the reality. Like, metaphorically speaking, I'd say, yeah, the Democrats are better than Republicans by about $1,400.
Yeah.
Like, that's it.
Right.
And the people who were offended by that didn't see that it was a joke. They couldn't tell that it was a joke.
Yeah.
Right. You know, obviously it's a fucking joke. You know what I mean? To anybody who doesn't have those goggles on. Basically,
my advice to you, dear viewers, is if you want to win a flame war with one of these people, if you have a sense of humor, use it.
Well, that's what Anis told me in the last couple conversations. Last
anyone else
we did.
Looking at it is going to gravitate towards you, because
you made that same point to me, Anis, that you have to use humor and mock these people.
Yeah, and
that's all you can do. That's all you can do.
Does, and that's why he gets under their skin, because
yes,
he's the greatest comedian and troll, and this is why you have to appreciate him, because he's showing the resistance was fake. We know that. But there's no comedy, there's no real humor. It's pseudo comedy that's produced under the auspices of the cultural industry, you know, and they are perfectly fine with this kind of pseudo satire, pseudo comedy, because it doesn't do anything. It just validates and perpetuates the system. It legitimizes it. But real comedy or satire would make you really angry and upset and like, you know, just agitate you. And that's sort of what Trump does. All you can have at this stage of empire is a troll who comes along and says the shit and says it openly, and also nakedly says that's what America has always been about. We're about making money at whatever cost. It's the art of the fucking deal.
Well, yeah.
Let's do it. We can't do it, but let's do it anyway. And fuck the world. We don't care about the world, about the planet. I'm not even going to pretend. That's it. That's pretty much the only service anybody can do at this point. And, you know,
well, on that point, if I could just interject one thing, sorry. He's a real insult to the meritocracy in that way.
Yes.
Right? Like self-made, quote unquote, rich people know that this guy's giving away the game, because this guy got rich by being a total fucking thug. You know? And so like it kind of peels back the skin off of this lie that if you just work hard and be honest and play by the rules, you can get ahead.
Right, because everybody knows he was bankrupt multiple times, right? It's still, you know, we don't know about his finances. They're very shaky. And yet he has status. He has built himself in a certain way, exploiting American capitalism's loopholes wherever he could. And he was never shy about that. He was like, yeah, that's what I did. Why wouldn't you do that? So again, that blows the cover off this, you know, capitalism as a form of meritocracy. One thing I was going to say is, you know, this exhaustion that Russell mentioned, and as I said earlier too, it happened in the 1970s. There did seem at one point as if after Nixon, Watergate, the end of Vietnam, that we were going to wind it up and just disengage. And then what we did is we revived it. We put the project on steroids. We restarted the Cold War with Reagan and Star Wars, and just we're going to end Russia. And that kept it going for 10 or 15 years. Then the Soviet Union ended, and then we had to come up with a new project to keep it going, and that was globalization, right? That was taking it even further. So, yeah, you're still there. Good. I lost my train of thought.
Globalization.
Yeah, so they're trying now, once again, with this exhaustion. So if Trump says, you know, we don't want these wars of regime change, and the meritocrats have brought back the father of institutional racism in this country for the last 50 years, and the one who was behind these wars of aggression to a large extent because he was, chair of foreign policy, in the Senate, right? And the idea is to restart this project, put it on steroids yet again. But I don't think it's going to work as it did in the 80s. I think.
I don't. And Daly, there's the thing with Biden.
Right.
Biden is really, this is a Forrest Gump presidency if there ever was one, where this guy just kind of stumbled in there. He doesn't have skills. Like, he doesn't have gifts. He's not particularly intelligent on any level, really. He's always been a pretty dumb guy.
Right.
I mean, you've got to be pretty stupid to plagiarize a speech from a British politician that's rather famous in that country without changing the biographical details. How can you be stupid enough to keep in a family of coal miners if that's not your story? I mean, at least how dumb do you have to be to?
Yeah,
he's a dumb guy. So, not surprisingly, he really didn't waste any time going back on his campaign promises right away. Don't think I can cancel those student loans. Trump immigration policies. Yeah.
So.
It'll take a while to unwind. He's too dumb to realize even that he cannot be that brazen at this point. Like this isn't 1995.
This is not that moment.
Making money and they weren't paying that much attention.
I never thought he'd be president. I never thought he had the intelligence. I even remember his 1988 campaign, with the plagiarism and all that, with people like Dukakis and Gary Hart and so on, and Jesse Jackson running against him. Again in 2007 when he did so poorly. I mean, it was just horrible. He was a laughing stock against Obama and Clinton. But this
in this election too. And then the party had to rescue him.
The dumbest guy on stage, just clueless, when 40 better people than him. And isn't that a sign, Keaton and Russell, that you can revive our corpse? He's like the Yuri Andropov. You've revived this corpse. And the establishment decided 3 years ago, it's going to be Biden and Harris.
Well, they were able to revive that corpse because they were able to convince their base of people that the country is so far gone that this is the least bigoted, the least retrograde suit that they will vote for. Right. And that points to a cultural decline as well. Right. Because the Democrats want to say we're restoring the soul of America. Well, if you wanted to restore the soul of America, the last fucking person you would choose to do it is Joe Biden. But they know they can't restore the soul of America. The soul of America is dead and buried. And so all they could do is fake it by cozying up to enough moderate Republicans in enough places to push them over the top. Even that strategy would no way have worked were it not for the once-in-a-lifetime circumstances under which the election took place.
Trump did better with the Republicans than any Republican has in decades.
Yeah, exactly.
All this talk about Biden Republicans, Trump took 94% of the Republican vote.
Right, and we always knew that, right, yeah. So, Keaton, are you saying that the establishment, this is a sign of cultural decline of the intellectual establishment, that they understood cynically that the people, the meritocrats, would be just fine with a person as compromised and soulless as Joe Biden, and that's the best they would go for, and they offered him and it worked, right? Is that what you're saying?
Well, I mean, that was their pitch to the people. I think behind closed doors, they knew he was dead.
Right.
And they knew he had no chance. And then they looked into this COVID thing happening, and that revived his chances. But their pitch to the people, this is what I'm talking about. I'm talking more about the people than I'm talking about the party leadership, is the people internalized this idea that the country is too far gone to go for someone to the left of Joe Biden. Right. And they internalize that because they have no confidence in their fellow people. The whole Democrat brand is that everybody is just too stupid to go along with us. And so we have to kind of cater to them in certain places. And they thought Joe Biden was the guy to do that because they know that there is no soul of America left. There is no soul of America left. This is the best they could do because this is the best this country will go for. Right. And so even the people who pose as these woke, forward thinking, liberal progressives, right, they have it in their gut. They know in their gut that the country is gone and that the best they could do is slow the decline by not letting Republicans take over, right, in their mind. And the way to slow that decline was to pick the most, electable, quote unquote, candidate, which means the most Trumpian candidate, which means we have to get as close to Trump as we can in order to beat him. Can't beat him with the antidote because there is not the spiritual, political, philosophical will out there in America to actually vote for the antidote. If that makes sense.
And that's actually true for the meritocrats. That's not true for poor people. That's not true for people who are outside this meritocratic system. But it is true for these meritocrats that this is more than good enough for them. This is more than good enough for them. For someone who wants to promise a return to normality, which was already really fucked up. But let's look at it from their point of view. What is the establishment thinking? Biden is just a figurehead. It doesn't matter who it is, what you call them. It's just the establishment. And that's why you have the entire Obama administration, from Susan Rice, all these horrible people, they've all come back, plus a new set of people that have been, in the, understudies. In the meantime, they're back now. What are they trying to do? They are upset at Trump, among other things, that for the reason that he did not take advantage of the COVID crisis in the way that they would have, which would have been a power grab, surveillance, more oppression. I mean, he just let it go, and he's like, okay, well, go live your lives. Many of you are going to die. That's what America has always been about. We died before. Fine. Lives can be lost, but we got to keep capitalism going. He's not even making a pretense of that. But these guys want more control. Any crisis, and I felt that in 99, 2000, I didn't know about 911 and the crisis that was almost imminent at that point. But I felt at that time that whatever crisis would come along, it would be horrible. It would not result in any good policies. It's interesting, people like Naomi Klein, or is it Naomi Wolf, both of the Naomis, I guess, and the others, who are, these progressives who get so excited about any crisis. They were excited even after 911. They thought this would be good. This would result in good public policy, that government would do good things for people. And they said the same thing after the COVID crisis. And what I'm saying is, whatever the nature of the crisis is, it's only going to be bad. There's going to be more inequality. People are going to be oppressed even more. They're going to lose jobs and security and housing and shelter even more. They're going to go into more debt. So the establishment wants to take control of COVID and future crises to deal with them the way they want to, with this unpredictability gone, with this cover in place about the fake innocence and so on. And it also wants to take control of the China conflict or narrative that Trump, brought out in the open, like, what is this? We've been, globalization has not been good for the American worker in many ways. China has taken unfair advantage, and let's deal with China. They also want to deal with China, but in their way. And what Trump was doing was not satisfactory to them. It could be a more militaristic way that they choose, but the military certainly was not going to trust Trump with making any aggressive military moves against China, nor was he interested in that, to be fair to him.
Well, so part of that $740 billion Pentagon package includes $2.2 billion for a stronger military presence in the Indo-Pacific region. So,
right.
They're
going to make moves in that direction. But I think from the point is that as bad as the situation seems to us, the way we've been describing, to the establishment, to the people who are continuing this, I mean, they could end empire tomorrow, right? You'd have to end wars, and in this country have some basic social policy, healthcare, debt, education. We know, living wage. It's just really, really simple. It could be over in 1 minute, right? And maybe it will be at a certain point. But they want to keep this shit going, put it on steroids. They want to do, and I'm telling you, they want to do what they did in the 1970s and 80s. They want to restart it big time, with horrible, horrible consequences for people around the world and here. And we're talking about exhaustion psychological guilt, moral panic, and all that is true. But for the people at the very top, they're thinking this is a great opportunity. Trump has now legitimized normal American liberal democracy, normal forms of American capitalism. That's how they interpret it. That's how they're selling it. That's what they mean by normality. Normality means that now you're okay with $100,000 college debt, but because at least you can go to college, without a pandemic making going to college impossible, right? You can go to Austin or Boston as a young person, go into tremendous debt and live in these unaffordable places, because at least that's possible. Whereas under Trump and the pandemic, out of control, even that wasn't possible. So you have normalized the really horrible shit because everything looks good to the would-be meritocrat compared to Trump and the pandemic, chaos. So they're thinking this is great. They're looking at it as a moment of opportunity, a reset for the next 10, 20, 30 years. They're excited about all this.
They are. I do agree with Keaton that it's not gonna work now. Our institutions are too weak, and you've also got now not just one generation, the millennials. Now you got the next generation coming up, Gen Z. Right. You've got two generations that are basically fucked, for whom this whole American dream thing doesn't exist. You can't have the vast majority of your young people that frustrated and disappointed and disenchanted with the system and just maintain the same old thing. I mean, with all of the psychic pressure in the society, you throw a war onto it, oh man. I mean, the country will come apart if you try to start a war in this environment. Well, and this is the problem. Joe Biden, Ryan Grimm was talking about how people who know Joe Biden, he has this public persona of being, the consoler in chief, right? This guy you want at a funeral. But behind the scenes, as I think was very evident in that recording that The Intercept got a hold of him talking to civil rights leaders, he says people who know Biden describe his personality as the personality of a dry drunk. That basically, not that he is a dry drunk, but he has that personality. Rough, abrasive, irrationally just nasty and defensive. Right. And if you listen to that tape, yeah, it sounds like that's who Biden is. So what kind of a president is this guy going to be? I can't think of very many people in my lifetime, or maybe any, who have occupied that office who have been less intellectually or temperamentally suited to it. And I actually include Donald Trump in that, because at least he had one trick, and they're the ones that you're talking about. He would come out and say, what do you think, we don't kill people? At least he had something. I mean, what are you talking about with Biden? He's going to both alienate his nominal frenemies on the left who might have given him a chance. He's already done that. And he's even going to alienate the people who are supportive of him. He's sitting there. Who the hell would say to a room full of, or a Zoom meeting full of black civil rights leaders, yeah, Latinos, there's more of them than they are of you. You better start working with them. What did they walk away from that meeting feeling or thinking about Joe Biden?
Well, you mentioned the millennials and post-millennials, and you don't think this is going to work. But my question to you, both of you, is how should they be thinking? I feel personally that, as I said at the beginning, I made what might seem like a shocking statement, is that for me, anybody who is invested at this point, after 80 years of this empire, and we've seen all the evil things it's capable of, both internally and externally, if you want to save America, if you are part of this project still, if you haven't taken that first step of saying, I'm done with this, I'm disengaging, I don't want this thing to be saved, I want this to go down. To me, that's a form of evil to me. Why would I be interested in millennial or post-millennial generation saving America? Because that's the only way they would be able to save themselves. And what would they be aspiring to? What would be the political mechanism? And to do what? To have some debt forgiveness, to make college more affordable in order to do what? To go to what? To learn what?
You're
to
right.
learn the systems of, perpetuating empire, because that's what college is about, right? To do what kind of job? If you go, you have jobs are just supporting this superstructure of global oppression and destruction of the planet. So what exactly are we talking about when we say the millennial and post-millennial generation, they're not going to put up with it? What is their vocabulary? What is their vocabulary of social change and historical change?
Well, you make a good point in terms of, look, domestically, essentially, they want European style social programs.
Who does?
For the most part, if you look at how they have voted.
You mean the millennials?
The millennials, the Gen Z, they lined up en masse behind Bernie Sanders by crazy numbers.
Right.
On foreign policy, they reflect a general deficit in their society. America has always had a blind spot with this in terms of public policy. We don't talk about it enough. It's very interesting to me how you saw so many African American leaders in the 60s and the 70s who explicitly tied their struggle to the oppression of non-white people in other countries by the United States.
Right.
And you hear so few, even from that community, making that connection today between the struggle here and what we're doing to people there, right? Yeah. So I'm not going to say, well, they've really got a well-articulated view on American empire and how to unwind it. They don't. And it's a reflection of a general lack of conversation about that in America over the last several decades. I agree that they need to. In terms of their domestic policy, European-style socialism seems to be where they are.
I don't know. In terms
of foreign policy, other than Israel, they don't seem to have given it a lot of thought. The only thing they have a lot to say about is Israel. Right. And even that, a lot would probably be an exaggeration.
Yeah. I just don't see how any of that is possible or even desirable. Their desire for, and that may well be true among that generation or those two generations in terms of something like a social, democratic European-style system. We are an empire in the last stages of imploding and exploding. We are lashing out at the world. That's what we did since 2000 in particular. We started in the 1990s. Where can we pick a spot to fight, to throw our military weight? We did that big time in the decade of the 2000s. It's interesting that just as in 2005-06, the foreign wars were sort of unwinding, Iraq and Afghanistan, immediately we turned that negative energy inside the country and went after immigrants. It really happened very precisely in 2006-07, and it's still going on. And now they're targeting the so-called deplorable. So now a lot of it is within the country. In that context of an empire exploding, and this is not like Britain, which handed it over to America, and we're like, okay, you are now going to be the inheritors of Anglo-Saxon, liberal, Lockean capitalism. Take it over from here, go fuck with the world. It's not like that. We have China in a very difficult situation. We have messed up Europe big time in the last 20 years. And how is it possible that in this climate of implosion, and again, I was wondering 20 years ago, is there going to be a soft landing, relatively soft landing, hard landing? It seems to me, it's clear now that we have gone for the hardest possible landing, and which makes, to me, feels very right and just that if I believe that this has been the most evil empire that has caused the most damage to human consciousness and the ecological stability of the planet, that it deserves that hardest possible landing. In the midst of this hard landing, how can any take place?
Well, but the problem is there's never been a planetary empire before. So just like the collapse of the Roman Empire brought the Dark Ages to its former protectorates and vassal territories, it didn't affect China, didn't affect India. It's not going to be like that. When America goes, everybody's going with America.
And that's fine.
You're talking about a Dark Ages for the planet.
Right. To me, that's fine. I mean, my end point.
Are you the guy who watches the zombie movie always assuming that he's going to be one of the plucky survivors?
I've never watched a zombie movie. Maybe I should start.
Anis, it's a date.
I think
on to one of my favorites.
I mean, you have to take it to the logical conclusion, which if you hear someone like Chris Hedges, he will agree with a lot of these points, and he will agree with the malevolent forms empire has taken. But in the end, he won't take the final step, and he'll say, I have a son, I'm worried about America. He wants to save America in the end. And that to me is a logical contradiction, because it doesn't follow from everything you've said. You should not want to save it. And I agree with you that to the extent that India has gone now, it's compromised, they're just a trashy, consumerist, horrible society. It's just they're just going down the toilet. China, we've destroyed what remains on Earth. And I agree that to the extent that we have assimilated the whole planet in this form of capitalism, this horrible form of liberalism, I'm completely fine with everything going down. And that seems to me still the most likely outcome.
But going down doesn't necessarily mean mass extinction, right? We're still going to be here. So what's going to happen?
Right.
So
the country what I mean is, will still be here.
You can decouple.
You still have to do something with it.
Right. You can decouple, I think, the idea that we have to preserve the empire with the idea that we have to kind of improve material conditions as best we can to make our lives here as easy, as comfortable, as peaceful as possible. Is it a losing battle? Yeah, maybe. But
do you think, Keaton, that capitalism, American capitalism, global capitalism is possibly going to retreat, reform, modify without taking down the planet?
I do not.
How is that conceivable?
I do not.
I don't.
No, I don't think it will either. But what Russell said is true, right? And this is the degree to which this is a depressing statement depends on how much longer you have left on the planet. But the younger generations, young people are socialists more than they are capitalists. And so eventually, right, you're going to move in that direction. The question is, can you do it in time? Which was one of the first questions that we asked. But to me, you can be both anti-empire and pro-human. Right, you can have a sort of love of humanity and also not feel particularly bad about the fact that this country is not going to be the shining city on the hill anymore. Now, I take your point that what's that?
That's how you get ratings, Keaton.
Hey, right. Well, Russell's holding up his cat, but we also have to figure our audio podcast audience who won't appreciate that. But that was Russell's cat that jumped on his lap. See, the animals are already taking over.
Yeah. I'd like to see, thank you for making my point. I would like to see animals take over and humanity go extinct. There, I've said it. I really
this little bastard will be the first one eating my face if something happens.
Well, like I said, Times Square is empty this year. So if we want to have a party, we can apply for a permit now. Everybody wear your masks, social distance. We'll have a New Year's Eve party in a somewhat different fashion. But we do have to wrap now because we've gone long. But this was, as I knew it would be, a great end of the year episode. And Anis, I'm glad you made that thesis at the end because that brought it all home. But Anis, do you have any writing you're working on now?
I finished a novel called Hopi over the summer. And by the way, I had COVID, so it was a really difficult time as I was doing that. Yeah, so COVID almost killed me. That's a whole other story. So, but I tried to keep going, and I wrote that Hopi novel in the summer. This is about a here we are talking about, preserving culture and civilization. So he is fighting in the Second World War. He goes back to the Hopi Reservation in 1951, and he tries to prevent a Mormon lawyer from basically selling off the Hopi resources, mineral resources, particularly coal, because he thinks that's just going to be the end of their civilization, and he wants to kill this guy on the reservation. So that's that novel. And then I wrote another novel in the fall. I've never written a novel about Texas, about Houston, where I am, and that's called Patel Mart. So this is about taking you back to the mid-1980s, during the time of the oil crash in Houston, and sort of exploring that frontier mentality, anything goes, which is less true of the city now, than it was. And I wasn't here in the 80s, but I tried to just recapture that moment in time in the middle of the Cold War. Reagan, it's going strong. And this is not a big part of the plot, but one of the things that's going on there in that novel is that we Americans are supporting the jihad in Afghanistan and the Mujahideen, who eventually became the Taliban and then Al-Qaeda. We called them freedom fighters on par with the founding father, right? That was Reagan. So that's a bit of
they even made a movie where Rambo goes and fights with them.
Right, exactly. Rambo can always go in and actually I made mention of Rambo.
What was that? Rambo 2
right,
or 3?
Important cultural moment, those Rambo movies. Yeah, just revenge.
Oh yeah.
Illusion, right? Like we didn't lose in Vietnam, but the top brass, tied our hands. We never really lost in Vietnam. In fact, we haven't won anything since the World War II, and maybe we didn't even win that. I mean, the more you research, what actually happened in World War II and who was responsible for, in terms of, Russia versus America, and how we won through almost brute force and bombing and so on. I mean, that's another story that people don't want to hear about. So anyway, we've just been on a losing streak, Korea, Vietnam, and it works best when we have these proxy coup d'etats and let other people do the fighting. It doesn't work so well when we go in and the world's greatest army, fights on land. It doesn't always work too well. So anyway, I finished that novel about Houston and trying to, offer a different take on immigrant life, on immigrant culture, than sort of what you would find the politically correct woke interpretation, of immigration. So it explores some of the darker, seamier sides of that culture. So that's what I did. And next I'll write a Wall Street novel.
All right. Well, don't get ahead of yourself, Mr. I hope the human race goes extinct. We might not have time for your third novel. Make sure these first two come out and then get to work on the third one if we're still here. But
I want to say that part of my personal sort of putting, the philosophy I'm articulating about retreating from America. I want the Wall Street novel to be the last novel I write about America. I mean, I want to disengage from that and not just fuck around with that for the rest of my life, because you can do novel after novel and just let this be the last thing I want to say. And then I want to move into more fabular, science fiction, metaphysical type of stuff, or if it's historical, move to other places and times. But I want to be done with this Wall Street novel in the spring and say, that's it. I don't personally want to write about America anymore. That's my personal, trying to be, less hypocritical, I guess.
All right. Well, you're always welcome on this show. Thank you so much, Anis, for joining us.
Yeah.